Welcome to today's webinar, The Science Behind Your Results, presented by Dr. James Anstead, AABB Laboratory Director at DNA Solutions. You can find the presentation handout on the lower portion of the GoToWebinar toolbox under Handouts. We are recording this session and will include the recording in a follow-up email. Questions may be submitted throughout the webinar using the GoToWebinar toolbox on the right side of your screen under the Questions tab. We will answer the questions submitted following the presentation. If we do not get to your question today, a list of questions and answers will be emailed to all attendees following the webinar. Thank you for joining today's session.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Dr. Anstead. Thank you for that introduction, Megan. So I just wanted to start by outlining our objectives for today. So today's objectives, we're going to first look at DNA and STR analysis in general. In particular, we're going to look at look to help you understand the inheritance of DNA. We're going to look at determining the cause and effects of mutations. We're going to explain DNA collection and extraction and application in simple terms, probably. We're going to talk about testing hypotheses, the relationship index and prior probability. We're going to look at how you calculate a statistical analysis using frequency and population data. We're going to explain the benefits of including mother samples, particularly in paternity trios. And then I'm going to go a little more in depth into understanding secondary relationships and complex family reconstruction. This final part will include one of the most common questions we get, which is who to add to a family tree and how to set up a family tree for a good test. All right, so all the work we do is based on DNA. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, which I'm sure most of you know, and it's the molecule that carries all the information necessary to make you you. It contains all the information that you need to make a human and how to make you specifically. It's made from two molecules, which we often refer to as strands. One of these strands you inherit from your father, and one of which you inherit from your mother. Use my pointer a little bit. So this is the kind of model of the structure of deoxyribonucleic acid, and you can see the two strands, they curl around each other. Eventually they condense into a much bigger kind of superstructure, which forms your chromosomes. All the information in the DNA is encoded by 4 bases. So just like a computer uses ones and zeros, your DNA has 4 bases, which are thymine, cytosine, adenine, and guanine. We abbreviate these to ATCG just so we don't have to say it all the time. The way they're arranged in the DNA helix is they're always opposite the same one. So adenine is always opposite thymine, and cytosine is always opposite guanine. The majority of this DNA is contained in the nuclei of your cells. The first thing we're looking to do in the lab is we're trying to get that DNA out. We can obtain good amounts of DNA from all kinds of cells. You'll obviously be aware that we often collect cheek cells, which are called buccal cells. We can use skin cells. We use blood sometimes. Only the white cells in your blood contain DNA. We use hair roots. We can even use an item that somebody's touched. So every time you touch something, some of your skin cells fall off. And we can try, and sometimes we're successful in collecting those from a surface. Within these DNA chromosomes are repeated regions, which we call short tandem repeats. Here's an example of one such motif. You can see here, this motif is CTAG, CTAG, and it's repeated. For each marker, the number of repeats might be different, and it varies between people. So in this first example, you can see there are 5 repeats of CTAG. And this one has 6, and this one has 7 repeats. All the repeats we use for human identity testing are either repeats of 4 DNA bases or 5. The 5 base repeats are called pentas. And if you guys have been using us, you'll notice on the report, there's some markers that say penta, and those ones have 5 repeats. They can vary in the number of repeats, and these variations are heritable. That is, they are inherited generally unchanged, and we'll talk about that a little bit before, from parent to child. So if your father has a 5 repeat, you may inherit a 5 repeat from him. When DNA testing started, they were originally chosen partly because they carry no medical information. So when DNA paternity testing was started, the labs that did it and the FBI were particularly interested in not having any medical information in that data because they didn't want to accidentally reveal someone's medical information or probably to be under HIPAA also. These alleles are passed from one generation to the other, and so we have a tree here, so you can see this in the picture here. You can see for each of these markers, you inherit one copy from your mother and one from your father. This example is just for one single marker, but you can see the principle. So you can see that here, this guy has a 6 and an 11, and he's passed an 11 on to his daughter. The mother has a 22-9, and she's passed a 22 on to her daughter as well. This makes single generation testing relatively easy, and that's where paternity started. We call it paternity these days. It's relationship testing. Barring mutations, if you don't share one of these markers with your parent, that means they're not your parent. So you can exclude someone based on the fact that they don't share one of these size markers. But as you can see, it gets a little more complicated when we look at grandparents and grandchildren. Several of the grandchildren in this example don't share an allele with one of their grandparents. So you can see this child here, she is a 522, so she has 5 repeats on one strand and 22 repeats on the other. Her grandfather has 6 repeats and 11 repeats, so he doesn't share any markers with her at that allele. So this is why you need more markers than just one. You can't do secondary relationships with just one marker, or even with just a few. And you need statistics. So you need statistics to tell you how likely it is, and then you need more markers because just a few markers won't work. All right. Now, I mentioned mutations earlier. Occasionally, during replication, you can get an error that occurs and an STR marker changes. There's 2 ways in which they generally change. This is the first way. So during replication, there's an enzyme that makes copies of this repeat, and it skips a whole repeat, and they call it slippage. So between one generation and the next, you can get 5 repeats becoming 6 repeats. The other kind of mutation you can get is when you gain or lose a single nucleotide. And you'll see this sometimes on a report. You might see a marker that has a 6.1 or a 5.9, and that means it has the general same motif with all the repeats, but it's lost either this repeats become 1 base longer, or it can become 1 base shorter too. Mutations are good. This is why there are lots of different allele sizes in the world, and we can use them as markers. If they were all the same and they stayed the same and never changed, they'd be pretty useless because they'd just be all the same for everybody. However, if it happens between 2 people we're testing, we have to deal with it both statistically in the test, and many of you may have seen the possibility of a mutation in tests you've submitted. You'll see that in the text. These mutations occur at known frequencies, which means we can take care of that statistically, usually about 1 in 1,000 generations per marker, but that does depend on which marker. We maybe see between 100 and 200 tests a year that have 1 mutation, and we see 1 or 2 that have 2 mutations. That's pretty rare. I haven't seen a 3 yet. You can see in the literature occasionally they find me 3 mutations, but we've only ever seen 2. All right, so now we're going to move on a little from like a little bit of the theory to start with to actually obtaining some DNA. So for our lab, 99% of our samples are buccal swabs. We use polyester swabs. You can use other substrates such as cotton, but they have some issues. Cotton cells particularly are great at collecting buccal cells, but they're very bad at releasing them. And we have to take extra steps to get the cells and the DNA back off the cotton swab. And the yield is very low. And this either means we have to do more work in the lab, or it means that the profile is sometimes partial. We lose some of those markers because there's so little DNA. So please use polyester swabs. We're happy to provide them. For the samples on the polyester buccal swabs, we can take the swab with the cells on it, and then we put in a solution that directly opens the cells, which lyses the cells and releases the DNA directly into that solution, and then we can go straight to analysis, which saves us a lot of time and effort. All right. So now we have some DNA. We have a solution with some DNA in it, but there's not enough to do much with, and we can't actually see those repeat markers yet or what sizes they are. So we use a process called the polymerase chain reaction to make lots of copies of those STR alleles. So essentially, I'm going to point here, we take a template, which is a piece of DNA, and then we can make, we break it into two, into the separate strands, and then we make copies of it. And we use this thing called a thermal cycle. There's a machine that heats it up and cools it down. And every time you go through a thermal cycle, you can make another copy of it. So you originally can start with one template copy, and then you get 2 copies, and you get 4 copies and 8. So every round, we make double the number of molecules, and eventually we make millions of copies of the regions that have these markers on. At the same time, the system we use adds a colored molecule to the end of those copies, so we can look at them. And so this is the system we use. Now, we didn't make this system ourselves. There's a number of commercial kits you can use. We happen to use one from Promega called Powerplex Fusion 5C. It's called 5C because it has 5 colors. It has blue, green, yellow, red, and then it uses an orange color for the ladder. And so the ladder has a number of set sizes in it. You put it in so that you can measure the sizes of the other markers. The markers are visualized on a machine we call a genetic analyzer, which separates them by size and measures each colored signal. You can see they're designed not to overlap in size, so they've made them the bits that we're going to amplify so they don't overlap. So you can take a particular size for each color and for each marker. And so this is what the data that looks like when we look at it. Each of these peaks represents a different allele size. And so you can see in penta E, there are 2 sizes. So this person has 2 copies, one from each. They inherited one of each of these penta E's from their parent. When you have only 1 peak appearing, here's one, D12, that means that person has a homozygote. That means they got the same size allele from both their mother and fathers. You might notice that on your reports. If you see a single number listed with an empty box beside it, that means that person was a homozygous at that site. These are the 23 markers we use. It's actually 22 markers plus amylogenin, which is the sex discrimination marker. You can have more markers. There are a few systems with more markers, but in second degree related kits, you do need more markers. So a 13 was the original most people started with, now 23. But you only get an improvement in the discrimination up to a certain point, and most of the commercial kits now have settled between 18 and 25. All right, so you have all your markers for your samples. So what are we testing? So I'm going to talk about testing hypotheses for the next couple of slides. In most paternity and maternity cases, you're first testing whether the father or mother is excluded as a parent of the child in this case. We consider a parent excluded if there are mismatches at more than 2 loci. So you think of that inheritance tree, and if you test 23 markers and there's a mismatch of 6 of them, that means that person can't be the parent. If they're not excluded, we use statistics to determine which is the most likely of 2 hypotheses. Now, for paternity and maternity, that's the random man hypothesis. So we have 2 hypotheses. One is that the alleged father that you sent in with the case is actually the father. The other hypothesis is some untested, unrelated man in the same population is the father. And so this might be text you'd see in a paternity report. The relative chance of paternity, assuming a 50% prior chance is, and they're normally very high numbers, as compared to an untested, unrelated man in the population that was selected. I do want to point out that it's incredibly important for us to know if there are possible fathers who might be actually related to the father you submitted. This approach only works for two unrelated individuals. We can do related fathers, we can test them, but you have to use a different approach. So say if you have two alleged fathers who are brothers, we have to take a different approach. So please, if you're submitting a normal paternity, if the fathers might be related in some way, please let us know. All right. The other approach we can use compares two different relationships. So in the previous example, I talked about we could compare which is the most likely of two brothers, but often we're dealing with more distant relationships. This example shows a relationship that is in question. The solid line, solid lines up here, and this one represent known relationships. And the dotted line is the relationship in question. So we know this is the mother of this child, and we want to know, is this child related to this untested alleged father? And generally in this case, we don't have the alleged father, so we're looking at either the uncle or one of the grandparents. In this case, it's the uncle. So we have the uncle, we don't have the father, we have the mother. So it's this relationship that's in question. And so you get some text like this. It is 1.7412 times more likely that person A and person B are related as first degree relatives rather than second degree relatives. Or it is so many times more likely that all individuals in the pedigree are related as defined to the probability is that only the relationship defined by solid lines, if any, are biologically related. So this first relationship is one you might see for a half sib versus a full sib. So you want to know if it's more likely they're first degree or second degree relatives. And in this case, we're looking at this tree, like specifically that tree. Obviously, it's important that the known relationships are correct. If they're incorrect, you can sometimes throw off the test. So if you have any doubt, please let us know. We can sometimes test these relationships first to confirm if you have more than one person. So obviously in this case, we could run a maternity with this mother and child to make sure that was correct. And then we can kind of build a tree out bit by bit if we need to. The other thing you'll obviously have seen on your reports is the relationship index. And so the AABB, they're our accrediting body, and they are fonts of wisdom about relationship testing. I'm on several committees for theirs, and it's always fun, but they have a definition of likelihood ratio, and they say a likelihood ratio compares the probability of the observed types given the hypothesized biological relationship between individuals and the probability of the observed types given the alternative hypothesized individual. So all these answers come in in a likelihood ratio. They're in terms of comparing two hypotheses, which in the case of paternity is often the random man. All right, so this is what a table would look like. Well, part of a table that you might see in a report. We develop statistics for each marker individually. More about that later. And you see the RIs here. If the RI is greater than 1, it supports the relationship for that marker. If it is less than 1, it opposes it. You'll probably have also seen the combined relationship index. And the combined relationship index is nothing fancy. It's just all those individual RI values multiplied together. I should also point out the rarer the marker that's shared, the higher the CRI. So if you see some really high numbers for RI, it normally means those two people shared like a very unusual marker in the population. The other thing you'll have seen on your relationship test is a prior probability. So this represents the strength of the non-genetic evidence that the hypothesized relationship is correct. We always use 50-50. So we always assume an equal chance of paternity, non-paternity, which is 0.5. There are scenarios in which you could argue that you might not use 0.5, like, if all your people were on a desert island and there's only 4 possible fathers. But for the sake of general testing, and this is true for nearly all labs, we all use 50%. All right. I won't talk hugely about the mathematics behind the relationships index. You can, if you're super interested, feel free to contact me, and we have reading material available. These are the equations for the RI, and they vary depending on the who you share a marker with. So in this case, combination of 1, the child has a homozygous for 1, marker size, the mother and the father all have the same marker. But I did want to point out how dependent the RI is on the frequency, or how common that marker in the population is. So in combination 1, you can see that the RI is simply 1 over P, and in this case, P is the frequency of that marker in the population. So if the frequency of the population, of that marker in the population is 10%, 0.1, then the RI is 1 over 0.1, which is 10. But if the frequency of that marker is 50%, like it's a really common marker, half the people have it, then the RI is only 2. So that's a big difference. And so that's really important that we know how common a particular marker is in the population. So please have your, if you're sending something in, make sure that your clients let you know what their population, what race they consider themselves. Please choose only one. Because it's a big job collecting all that data, and we use the FBI's data that they've collected, and they have a big database. There's only a limited number of races that have been analyzed like this, so there's only a limited number of choices, but please have people choose the one that they think is closest. All right, I wanted to go on and talk about an actual test now. So all the tests I'm going to talk about in this webinar are tests that are commercially available as proficiency tests. So these tests do represent real people, but they've given their permission for their DNA to be used in proficiency testing in the laboratory, and they're fine with the data being released. And so you won't see any names. I do have one test further on that's a de-identified test that we ran that we have permission to use educationally. About 3/4 of our testing is paternity. And here's an example of a regular 2-person paternity test with a report that we generated. It's a father-child test. We ran the markers. You got a great result. The probability, the relationship index is in the billions in this case, and we have a probability of 99.9999. Nice inclusion. Clients are happy. Everybody's happy. Now we generally ask for the mother too. So here's that same test as a trio, so with the mother added as well. We always want to include the mother if we can. And so here's the combined relationship index and the probability of relationship for the trio with the mother, same test. CR went up, right? Now it's in the billions. It's in fact about 36,000 times higher than it was. That's because for some of the markers, we have even greater certainty, so a higher number that they came from the alleged father, as we know where the other allele came from, the maternally derived one. But you might say, so what? Those are both acceptable results, right? No one's going to be upset with either of those results. You've got to send it out to your clients and everyone will be happy. So absolutely, that's absolutely true. But I want to show you the same test with a mutation at penta C and 2 markers missing. That's not an uncommon occurrence, like a slightly, you get a sample with slightly less DNA and we dropped a couple of markers, or it was from an ME sample and they don't always amplify as well, and then we have a single mutation. Incidentally, the RI for mutation is based on how often they occur, and so how often that particular marker mutates, so that you'll see a different number for each marker. And you can see, so when you have a mutation, it makes this number very low because mutations are unusual or unlikely, but we can still look at that in the statistics. All right, in this case, we now have a CRI of 83 and a probability of relationship of 98.8. This is considered inconclusive for paternity. If the CRI is less than 99, we have to release it as inconclusive, or we have to do something else. So, in this case, we have a problem. So let's see what happens when we add the mother back in. So same profile, same test, single mutation, 2 markers missing. You can see that putting the mother back in doesn't make any difference to the RI for the mutated marker, but it does change some of the others. So with the mother added, we're back to a conclusive paternity test. CRI is 404,000 and a 99.99997% probability of relation. And hopefully everybody's happy. Never know with paternity tests if everybody's happy, but in this case, hopefully everybody's happy. All right, so puzzles are better with all the pieces. DNA stats are better with both parents. Please send us your mothers if you can. If they're available for testing, we'd much rather have trios than duos. All right, so let's move on to secondary relationships a bit. Now, sometimes these are serving as kind of proxies for an unavailable alleged father. So sometimes we're using grandparents to reconstruct whether an alleged father is the father of a child, but sometimes they're not always. Sometimes we're just people are looking to determine if these people are their relationships or find someone. Secondary tests are those for grandparents, aunts and uncles, siblings. We can sometimes go further than secondary relationships, but often we need some intermediate people. So you can go out to cousins sometimes, but you might need extra people in the tree to give that some more power. All right, secondary relationship tests always involve the comparison of two hypotheses, which we talked about earlier. The AABB, which is our accrediting body, in discussion with all the labs, essentially have set some global rules for reporting these. That's partly just because these make statistical sense. It's partly so that you will see the same language regardless of which DNA testing lab you send it to, as long as they're AABB accredited. There are some unaccredited labs out there, but they can't do legal testing. So if the likelihood of relationship is 0 to 9.09%, it's not supported. If it's between 9%, 9.09% and 90.9%, it's inconclusive. And if it's between 90.9 and 100%, it's supported. The numbers look a bit weird. That's because they actually correspond to particular CRIs. So not supported is a CRI between 0 and 1, and then supported, inconclusive is 1 to 10, and supported is 10 to 100. And you're probably used to seeing these verbally in your reports. And actually, I believe there's actually, I said that wrong for the CRIs. So hang on. All right. Finding additional relatives can be even more important in secondary relationships. Here's an inconclusive avuncular test. You can see this one was pretty close. So we have a combined relationship index of 9.49. So it's almost supported. Probability of relationship is 90.47. But at this point, we'd be reporting this out as an inconclusive test. Everyone tested had a full profile, and the alleged father and grandparents in this scenario are deceased, so we don't have anybody else to test. The father's full sibling was the only one available. He's the only available relative, so what can we do? Even though the mother isn't directly involved in the potential relationship, we can still add her to the test. In fact, we could have even added a relative of the mother's, such as one of her parents or her sibling. Essentially, when we add her profile, when we have her profile, we can subtract it from the child's profile, and then we have more information about which alleles the child in question inherited from their alleged uncle via the unavailable father. When I say we, I mean the computer software we use. I tell it all this information and it tells me that answer. So in this case, adding the mother gave us a nice supported relationship, 99.6419%, relationship index of 278. Great answer, everybody's happy. So if you have questions about secondary relationships you're running, please reach out to us in the lab. We can help, we can give you advice on who to collect. I will talk a little bit about that though. But yeah, if you ever get stuck, please let us know. We can help work out a testing plan for you. This is an example of an actual test we've run. So in this case, we needed to link untested GP1 up here with this test child. This test was needed to include this grandchild on a Native American tribal roll. GP1 was deceased. MO was deceased, but we had a tested child available And initially we had these two half siblings to the untested mother of the known father. We were able to link the known father through his untested mother to the GP1 because we had these two half siblings. However, this test was considered inconclusive by the tribe. They actually require a 99% likelihood for inclusion on the tribal rolls by DNA testing. But it turned out that GP2, which was the grandmother, was still alive. She was in her 90s. And when we added her, we were able to show to a 99% certainty that the child should be included on the Native American rolls, and that was all accepted, and that was a great outcome for everybody. So the question we get asked most is, who can we add in secondary relationships? And so ideally, we'd like a family tree, but what we're really looking for is information that adds something new. So if you're trying to identify a possible father, say we're trying to identify whether this is the father of one of these children, but he's unavailable, but we do have the child's mother, adding additional relatives on the mother's side won't help. So we already have the mother. So there is no new information to be able to be gained from her parents or from her siblings because we already have her full profile. What we'd like is additional relatives on the father's side. So say you already had a paternal uncle on this side, but it was still inconclusive. If you can get a paternal grandfather, if you can get another paternal uncle that is a sibling to either full or half to this father, then that can add more information about the father, and statistically that'll be taken into account in the test. Adding additional on the relatives on the father side then would likely help. I say likely because it does vary, but as you add more people, it moves the statistics away from inconclusive generally. It'll push it in one direction or the other, either to be supported or unsupported. We don't know which way until we do the testing. So if it's inconclusive, it can go either way. And you can have a test go from quite close to being supported to completely unsupported after adding more relatives. If you have any doubt, the best thing to do is get your client to give you a rough family tree, indicate who's related to who and in which way and which people might be available. And then we can definitely help you from that. We often have people supply us with family trees, and then we can talk through what the options are that are available. Always remember also that there might be other samples out there somewhere. Samples from the ME, from hospital laboratories or law enforcement agencies are all generally acceptable for legal tests. And we can talk you through that if that's an option. We're always surprised how often there's a sample lurking somewhere unexpected, a blood sample that was taken 3 years ago for a diabetes test or something. If it's an informational test and you don't need it to go to court, we may be able to get DNA from a personal item, such as a toothbrush or razor. Please do contact us if that's something that you have, or if you have something really out of the ordinary. We can give you an idea of how best to preserve it and ship it, and how likely it is to work. We can generally give you a, absolutely, like, cremated remains, absolutely no chance it's going to work. Toothbrush nearly always work. Although occasionally we get a mixture. Surprising how many people's toothbrushes have more than one person's DNA on them. Finally, you could consider Y-STR and mitochondrial testing. Only males have Y chromosomes. So the Y chromosomes transmitted directly from father to son. If you're going to use a Y chromosome test, you need an unbroken male lineage from your person to your sample. So here we have G grandpa. He has this blue Y DNA, which he passed to his son. But his son had a daughter, so she doesn't get the Y chromosome. So there is a great grandson in this direction, but he does not share Y DNA with this G grandpa. He does with his dad, but his dad's from a different lineage. Whereas this uncle here, he shares Y DNA with his great grandpa because there's an unbroken male lineage from him to him. So particularly for Y testing, it's really important to know who's related in which way, not just that they're a grandfather, but that you might need to know which side they're Mitochondria follows the female line. So G grandma gave her mitochondrial DNA to G aunt and to grandpa, but it didn't get passed on because he's not passing his mitochondrial on to anybody else. Mitochondrial testing is relatively expensive, just relatively, so always bear that in mind too. Y testing is not significantly more expensive really than STR. Both of these tests can be added to an inconclusive STR result to improve its power. So if we have a test and it was inconclusive and you're looking at it and thinking you might have a male lineage, you could add Y to it or mito. I will note that they can only be used on their own to exclude someone as a relative. The reason for this is that lots of people share the same Y profile. Even in this example, you can see that there are people who share the same Y profile in the population. The Y profiles aren't unique. A lot of people share them. Same with mitochondrial profiles. You can exclude someone with a Y profile. So if you have an alleged father and they don't share a Y profile with their child, they're not his father essentially. But if it's not excluded, we can just use its statistics to add to the STR statistics, and they normally help because Y profiles, while they're not unique, are relatively rare. So maybe 1 in 1,000 people share a Y profile. All right, that's all I had. I think Megan's going to say a few words.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Anstead, and thank each of you for your time today, for joining our webinar. At this time, we're going to take some questions. As a reminder, questions can be submitted using the GoToWebinar toolbox on the right side of your screen under the Questions tab. And if for some reason we do not get to your question today, a list of questions and answers will be emailed to all attendees following the webinar. And we do have a couple questions that have been submitted. Please feel free to upload your questions now if you have any. Dr. Anstead, can you please explain the meaning of the false positive statement often seen on reports and why it's only shown on some of them?
Okay, so so if you've submitted reports that are two-person secondary relationship, so that would be an avuncular or a grandparent, then we have to, because the AABB requires this to produce, include in the report, an indication of how likely this is to be false positive. So as well as the statistics, which we show for the STRs, some researchers have data where they actually took real populations with hundreds of thousands of real relationships, and they wanted to show how often you could get a false inclusion. So that would mean if you took someone random, how often could you get a greater than a 90.9% chance that they're included just by picking somebody random. And so that's the statistic that we use for that. So the false positive one is how likely, so I think it's less than 1%. If you took someone random, would they have, at a CRI of 9, how likely would it be to include them falsely? And the same for a false exclusion. They took lots of populations of real uncles and nieces and nephews and determine how often it would say they were under the 9%. And so that gives you an idea of whether it's possible. And I will caution that, especially for secondary relationships, if it's very close to that borderline for supported and not supported, and your client is really, really sure of that relationship or that it's not, it's always worth including some extra people because that'll improve the statistics. And those false positives are only true for tests with only 2 people in. So once you get to 3 people, it's much more certain that the results are correct. And obviously, if your CRI is a long way from the threshold too, if your supported CRI is like 10 million, you're probably fine too. So it's just for those that are very close to the borderline.
Okay, wonderful. We have another question. If a client does not mention that the brother may be the father, how likely is the test inconclusive?
So actually, you're more likely to get a false positive. That's the problem. So we had a case where we had 2 full sibling brothers, and one of them was submitted as the father, and he had a single mutation. And so on his own, we would have said he was the father with just one mutation, but his brother was actually the father. So we ran both tests. Fortunately, they had told us, and so we could show that it was more likely that the test without the mutation was the other one. If they don't mention that he may be the father, you might get a test that looks a bit odd, like it would, it might be conclusive, but not by very much, or it might have 2 mutations in. And so, yeah, it's really important we know that, especially if they're full siblings. That's the worst case scenario. If that didn't answer your question, Dominic, please put something else in the questions.
Okay, we have one that someone has asked where they can get a copy of the slides. On your go-to webinar toolbox on the right side of your screen, there's also a handouts tab. Within that handouts tab, there should be a PDF printout for all of the slides that you see in today's presentation. And then also you should receive an email following the end of the webinar that will give you a recording of the slides as well. We also have a client asking, are cousins helpful when there are no other relatives available?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Yes, they are, particularly if there's more than one. You know, we're trying to gather as much information as we can. And so, yeah, cousins can be helpful. If there are several of them, that's also helpful. They'll add some strength. It kind of depends sometimes on how close to a threshold you are. So, you know, they can add a couple of CRIs sometimes, and that might be enough to bring it to supported. We've done we did do one test where we had 5 cousins, and it gave a, you know, that's a bit unusual, but it gave a great result. But yeah, they can be helpful.
Okay. Someone asked me to go over the handouts one more time. So in the webinar toolbox where you have this questions tab, there's also a tab called handouts. And if you will just click the arrow next to that to expand it, there should be a PDF attachment that you can download straight to your PC to see all of the slides. Looks like we have some more questions here. If we normally report out 22 alleles and the result only reports out 10, could the alleles that were not reported be a not match? However, the results still report out as conclusive. That's a great question.
Hey, Dominic. Yeah, so if we reported out 10, that normally means the sample wasn't very good and we missed some. Theoretically, theoretically with 10, at least for a paternity, you shouldn't get a false exclusion, with the exception, it would be particularly bad in this case if the fathers were suspected to be related and we didn't know, because having 10 matches with your brother that then are passed on is really possible. In terms of the random man hypothesis, at least for a paternity, that you should still have the correct result. It gets a little more difficult for secondary relationships. With only 10 markers in a secondary relationship, your stats might be low, and so that's possible. You know, even at a 10%, you know, even at a 5% likelihood, you know, that still means sometimes that test could be incorrect. So we're not supposed to report out secondary relationships unless we've tried at least 20 markers, but you can report them out with 10 if you tried 20. Generally, I'd want another sample if there were only 10 markers, unless, you know, occasionally this happens when you have someone who's deceased and that's the only sample you can get and you have to report it out with 10, but I really would like to see more. But for paternity, it shouldn't matter unless the fathers are related. We don't know.
Okay. It does look like some people may still be having some trouble viewing the handout, so I will follow up on the webinar with an email to the attendees with that attachment so that I'm sure you are to get those. We do have a question here that asks if half-sister DNA results with 45% and both have a lot of the same markers, are they related?
Thanks, Ebony. Yeah, they could be. So they could be really and it's important if we know they might be related in another way. 45 is inconclusive. It's hard to tell, but it is possible you know, if they don't really know how their family tree might look, it's possible they might be cousins or something. That would make it more likely it would be inconclusive, but it's hard to say. In a case like that, I'd really want to see if we could add some more people to that tree.
Okay. I think that has touched base on most of the questions we've received. We'll give just a couple minutes for people to throw some more up there if they have any that come to mind. Okay. Well, again, I just want to thank everybody for their time today. We will follow up with an email with both the recording of today's webinar and handouts. This will also be added to our YouTube page and website for further education down the road. And if any other questions come to mind, please reach out to us. And thank you guys for joining today.